Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We're delighted to see such a lively crowd. It feels like reunions are happening all over the place, which is lovely. So good afternoon and welcome to the 2022 Director's Essay Prize Lecture. My name is Kate Clark LeMay, and I am the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery. The Director's Essay Prize Award is part of the National Portrait Gallery's Scholarly Center, Portal, which was first launched in 2017 with myself and former senior historian David Ward at the helm. Since then, we have expanded our scholarly programming at the National Portrait Gallery enormously, featuring 2 annual study days to accompany exhibitions, monthly virtual lectures highlighting the portraiture of the United States in various themes, in-person lectures to celebrate Pride, an informal biannual writing workshop, and a major biannual symposium. Portal's aim is to recognize and nurture scholarship addressing portraiture of the United States, particularly the scholarship that works to expand the definition of portraiture. The Director's Essay Prize and its accompanying lecture have become the hallmark of our programming, for it represents excellence in the field of portraiture and opens new conversations about the visual biography, identity, and art of the United States. This year's prize winner is Dr. Tiffany E. Barber, Assistant Professor of African Art History at the University of California at Los Angeles. Before we hear from Dr. Barber, I would like to thank the jurors of the Essay Prize, Drs. John Stauffer, Rebecca Van Diver, and Chipu Wang, who also serve as advisors to Portal. Dr. Barber will be introduced momentarily by Dr. Rebecca Van Diver, Associate Professor of African American Art at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Van Diver received her AB from Harvard University and an MA and PhD from Duke University. Her research and teaching focus on African American and Black diasporic art, with an emphasis on 20th century Black women artists, and more recently, the use of ephemeral print in African American art. She is the author of Designing a New Tradition, Lois Mailou Jones and the Aesthetics of Blackness, published with Pennsylvania State University Press in 2020. At present, Dr. Van Diver is writing a book on African American artistic inventions in moments of racial turbulence titled States of Emergency, The Politics of Ephemerality in African American Art, 1965 to 2020. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Van Diver.
It's such a treat to be here today, and especially given the historic nature of Black portraiture in this week with the unveiling of the new Obama portraits at the White House. And I'm fortunate enough to be in week 4 of my African American art survey at Vanderbilt. And I was telling them about coming here today to honor Dr. Tiffany Barber on the occasion of her winning of the National Portrait Gallery's Essay Prize. And I'll talk about her winning submission in a moment. And I asked my students, what is a portrait? We spent a lot of time at the start of the semester talking about the power of representation, talking about the power of taking agency in picturing yourself, and sort of how we can harness that power of the portrait. And I asked a student in a review session, what is a portrait? And they said, among other things, it captures a moment. And that stuck with me. And I told them that I was going to call them out today because I said, this is really also capturing a moment and a portrait of what the field of American art history can look like, what the field of portraiture studies can look like. So echoing Dr. LeMay, I want to say thank you for coming here tonight to celebrate and learn from Tiffany E. Barber, whose winning submission was an article on the performance artist Narcissister that explored how Narcissister's art gestures beyond the body to question the limits of racial and gender identification. And to highlight how race profoundly affects our cultural, especially liberal, imagination. The jurors, of which I was one, found Barber's examination of Narcissister's use of narcissism as an aesthetic, racial, and political strategy compelling, original, and groundbreaking. For those of you who have not yet had the occasion to read the piece, I can tell you it's available without paywall on Art Journal Open, so take advantage. Don't pay for those PDFs. And it is my true honor to sort of continue in this vein of portraiture and thinking about family portraits and a lineage in which Dr. Barber and I both share in some of our shared intellectual experiences. And Dr. Barber is the newly announced Assistant Professor of African American Art at the University of California, Los Angeles, and is also the curator in residence at Delaware Contemporary. And I think it's important to highlight Dr. Barber's activities both within traditional scholarly publications as well as her many curatorial efforts. Prior to joining UCLA, and I hope she'll still maybe think of the East Coast as on par with the best coast, Barber was an assistant professor, maybe, I don't know, okay. Dr. Barber was an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Art History at the University of Delaware. She is fresh off a year-long fellowship at the Getty Research Institute, where she was working on her current book project, Undesirability and Her Sisters, Black Women's Visual Work in the New Millennium. Her research and curatorial work have been supported by fellowships at Art Table, the Delaware Art Museum, and an institution that is close to my own heart, the University of Virginia's Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. And I want to make mention that Dr. Barber is committed not only to the discipline of art history, but also deeply invested in Black studies, and brings a number of new and important insights into both of those fields. Barber received her PhD in Visual and Cultural Studies for the University of Rochester and an MPAS from the Bosque School of Fine Arts, the University of Southern California, and she received a BFA in Dance from Fordham University and the Ailey School. It is with immense pleasure that I introduce to you Tiffany Barber.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for that amazing introduction, Rebecca. It's really a pleasure to be here among so many familiar faces, friends, family. Anybody who follows me on social media or has gotten a text message from me in the last 2 days knows it's my beautiful mother's birthday, and she's in the audience with me today. And this is just a real treat because, as Rebecca mentioned, I started as a dancer and then fell into art history, partially because of my mother, who is a visual artist, and her my encounters with her visual art practice in my early years actually deeply informs my work as an art historian and curator now, and you'll see some of that in the presentation. But I just want to thank you all for being here. I have so many friends from my Ailey world. Where's Izzy? There she is. Ailey world. LA, Getty, I have Getty crew in the building. It's just, and other people from my consulting days. And, I'm working on the AP course in African American Studies that you probably read about in the Time magazine, or on CNN, something like that. I have people from that, so it's just wonderful to be here. Thank you all so much. This prize means a lot to me, and I'm going to share some of my prize-winning essay with you, but I'm going to put it within the context of my current book project that Rebecca spoke to on Black women's art and activism in the 21st century. So I look forward to questions and conversation afterward. In the midst of Barack Obama's final year as president, the Black Lives Matter movement, and growing public awareness of the intricacies of intersectionality, Beyoncé released her 6th solo project, Lemonade. In it, she brought new life to one of Malcolm X's most poignant social reflections that continues to energize academic and popular writing about the vulnerability of Black women and girls today. Black women, the Black nationalist civil rights leader averred in a fiery 1962 speech about police brutality, are the most undervalued people in America. When Beyoncé released Lemonade to critical acclaim in 2016, the album recalled this sentiment and the political moment that birthed it, joining the civil rights movement of the 20th century with the new millennium's Black Lives Matter movement. Seen as an expression of Black women's pain and triumph over everything from infidelity to familial strife to present-day police brutality, Lemonade was heralded as a revolutionary work of Black feminism. Visually and sonically, the album addressed Black women's practices of care and self-love in response to the most insidious forces of oppression, patriarchy, white supremacy, misogynoir, and state-sanctioned violence. At the interpersonal level, Beyoncé's experiences with her celebrity husband's infidelity melded the private devaluation of Black women by their partners with the national socio-political devaluation of Black women in the US. As a result, the album prompted wide-ranging conversations about womanhood, feminism, musical genres, and who can claim Black identity and culture in a purportedly post-gender, post-genre, post-Black world. The album also inspired countless think pieces, rave reviews, and one crowdsourced syllabus populated with more than 200 Black feminist and womanist texts. According to Candace Marie Benbow, writer, theologian, and lead organizer of the Lemonade syllabus, Black women saw themselves as they watched chapter after chapter, lamenting the degradation they encountered in their intimate partner relationships and at the hands of a state supposed to protect them. Lemonade, quote, left sisters exposed, yearning for a covering, for real healing and transformation, end quote. From this angle, the album's visual and sonic elements coalesce solidarity and sisterhood into communal healing and wholeness. In this merger also lay a call for freedom for the most disrespected, unprotected, and neglected. But what does Beyoncé have to do with art history? And if Dr. Cheryl Finley were in the building, she'd tell you a whole lot. Since departing Destiny's Child for a solo career in 2003, the singer has become a global icon. She and her husband, rapper and philanthropist Jay-Z, have occupied the Louvre, supported contemporary struggles for Black freedom, and amassed one of the most robust collections of art of the Black diaspora. Her paradoxical performances have also inspired heated debates about contemporary Black feminism, racial belonging, intellectual property, capitalism, and aesthetics. With every surprise album drop, one of which we just lived through, Beyoncé breaks the internet and sets new technological, discursive, and entrepreneurial trends, from music to motherhood. As literary scholar Tiffany E tells us, Beyoncé's pregnancy transforms her into a fertility goddess. Her heartbreak in Lemonade becomes the pain of a Black woman collective. Her videos and lyrics produce memes and slogans that become personal anthems, end quote. Additionally, her fans have claimed her albums, her work ethic, her dance moves, and her offspring, the fruits of her creative and procreative labors, as stimuli for social transformation. She is, in a word, phenomenal. However, and perhaps most importantly for my purposes, Lemonade and the critical acclaim surrounding its ethos of repair and redemption coalesces a core problem for historians of contemporary Black art and visual culture: that Black women's visual work should and must be recuperative. As Lemonade's popularity in academic and public discourse demonstrates, more people than ever before are engaged with Black women and their creative output as triumphant examples of Black achievement and intersectional feminism. Black visual culture more broadly has garnered unprecedented art market visibility, corporate support, and viral social media attention in the past decade, what many popular as well as academic thinkers and makers have called a new Black renaissance. Between 2012 and 2022, museums, magazines, small businesses, global brands, and media networks in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter uprisings issued dozens of statements touting their commitments to racial justice and solidarity. And walking today throughout DC, you still see remnants of that, all the postings. We stand with Black Lives Matter in windows and decals attached to glass on the buildings. Imbibing fine art, popular culture, and social media have become the primary and preferred sites for pursuing social justice and redressing anti-Black violence in the past and present. Yet, narrow ideas about cultural and political representation, racial and gender solidarity, and art's transformative power continue to constrain Black women's visual work. How does the increased visibility of Black women artists, at once historically marginalized yet hypervisible in public and civic culture, impact how we theorize minoritarian aesthetic practice within art history and Black study? Okay, good. What are the limits and possibilities of kinship and sisterhood in the 21st century? In times of racial reckoning and upheaval, what do we expect Black women and their art to do? Undesirability and Her Sisters, Black Women's Visual Work in the New Millennium, locates and addresses these questions within the context of present-day understandings of progress and struggle, wherein racial representation has become a metonym for racial reparation. As the title suggests, my project collates what I term undesirable images of Black female bodies in recent sculpture, collage, photography, and performance art by Carol Walker, Wangechi Mutu, Xavier Simmons, and Narcissister. Like Beyoncé, the artists I profile in the book raise important questions about marginality and representation as they navigate their own star statuses within the art world. Walker, Mutu, Simmons, and Narcissister also blur the boundaries between fine art and popular culture and perform Black womanhood and Black feminism in confounding ways. However, unlike Beyoncé, these artists eschew wholeness and cohesion through repeated uses of rupture and repulsion, instead embracing minor aesthetic strategies such as nausea, dismemberment, self-effacement, and self-objectification. As stratagems of refusal, they move away from a unified notion of Black female being and sisterhood, while also jettisoning assimilation, metamorphosis, and repair as goals. Beyoncé aside, Undesirability and Her Sisters investigates the cutting edges of Blackness's persistent visualization in the wake of contemporary art's post-Black turn and the mainstreaming of intersectionality, an era defined by hope, change, and ideas about racial transcendence on the one hand, and terror and anxiety on the other. To do this, I consider how rupture and fragmentation continue to condition the myriad ways art historians, curators, critics, collectors, and influencers frame Black aesthetics and art's transformative potential in practice and in theory. Restoring fragments of identity, taste, and cultural history to wholeness animates much of the literature on Black aesthetics. At the height of the Harlem Renaissance, W.E.B. Du Bois believed all art to be propaganda, and that African-American artists' emulation and mastery of Western aesthetic ideals, such as beauty, would yield social, political, and economic enfranchisement for people of African descent. Larry Neal, a proponent of the Black arts movement, rejected this model of elitism and assimilation, seeing art as a catalyst for revolution, Black self-determination, and nationhood. For Thelma Golden at the turn of the 21st century, Black artists' relationships to history and struggle had changed. Her conception of post-Blackness sought to unburden Black representation from explicitly political agendas to highlight artists of African descent's formal innovations and the capaciousness of Blackness. Yet, notions of recovery and repair under the guise of kinship continue to organize the study of Black artistic production in general, and Black women's visual work in particular, even as racial and gender subjugation persists. To redress the ruptures caused by slavery and its afterlives, metaphors of kinship have been used in Black aesthetic discourse to imagine bonds and obligations between individuals of African descent and their communities. From womanist theologians to public intellectuals, Black women's visual work in the US has been synonymous with kinship, sisterhood, mothering, and reproduction. Kinship and sisterhood in this context typically refer to racial and gender affinity, common ancestry, and togetherness as sources of redemption and the basis of a shared politics. The act of making kin, familial and fictive, has also been tied to kind and kindness for Black women, especially when that work takes the form of caring for children and nations not their own. Black women's reproductive labor on this model of kinship and sisterhood engenders revolutionary care practices, as well as unique ways of being in the world, a triple otherness that I call undesirability and alterity at the intersection of race, gender, and sexuality. Furthermore, transhistorical studies of Black women's creative labors, including caregiving during slavery and its afterlives, cultural production, and political participation in the post-civil rights era, often consolidate sacrifice, self-care, and salvation. In this complex formulation, the slave past is the origin point for Black political realities in the present, and art functions as a form of restorative justice. This ongoing and elusive process of repair and liberation, according to art historians Huey Copeland and Krista Thompson, comes, quote, into view through repeated attempts at its visualization, end quote. While other scholars frame Black women's cultural production as sites of resistance, reparation, healing, and pleasure, my project explores the value of fragmentation and dispossession in terms of social location and aesthetic form. Responding to the need for experimental risk and rigor with regard to the roles fragmentation and refusal play in contemporary African American art and performance, my book in progress ultimately advances a growing discord within Black aesthetic thought and its preoccupation with representation's reparative potential. Each chapter focuses on a specific artist, one of their signature mediums, and the aesthetic strategies they have developed over the last 20 years. Evoking olfactory, sonic, surface, and haptic responses, minor aesthetic strategies in and of themselves, not often discussed in art historical scholarship. The dismembered, perverse, and repulsive figurations that I profile in my book challenge normative modes of depicting Black women and their bodies as at once empowered and vulnerable. In so doing, they directly undermine expectations for Black women's work to be pleasing, on the one hand, and for it to redress racial and gender subjugation on the other, thus unsettling the common theorization that representation, solidarity, and repair are mutually constitutive and socially good. In weaving these threads together, my work also contributes to recent and ongoing debates about the ethics of self-representation, the ability to act or speak for oneself, to mean and matter, and to ultimately refuse recognition when calls for reparations and equity proliferate. Carol Walker's A Subtlety is the foundation for my analysis of undesirability and the minor aesthetic strategies it spurs. For 9 consecutive weekends in 2014, the colossal sugar-coated Sphinx could be seen in the now defunct Domino Sugar Refinery in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Droves of people, myself included, queued for hours in New York's summer heat to ogle and snap pictures of the work. When I finally made it into the refinery, I was overwhelmed, not so much by the sight, but by the smell. The molasses-caked walls emitted a scent so strong as to be nauseating. The Sphinx's sugar babies, a cadre of resin-cast servant boys with stereotypical Black features positioned throughout the looming space, were coated in molasses, melting and crumbling to pieces like the refinery's walls. A Subtlety was large, sticky, and repulsive. Over the course of the exhibition's run, the Sugar Babies baskets, historically intended for the collection of sugarcane and other crops, accumulated the dismembered arms and heads of the other molasses boys. The Sphinx itself was monumental and nude, a stark white female figure with the head of a mammy, a stereotype that originated in slavery. This figuration incited criticisms claiming that the installation made light of ongoing racial pain and Black women's historical and contemporary subjugation, presupposing art's transformative power and recuperative attachments to Black women's creative labors. A Subtlety, however, exaggerates Black female bodily abjection and turns away from social and aesthetic norms concerning racial healing and respectability. In so doing, it forces a distinction between Black women's creative labors as artists and caregivers and art's capacity to mitigate historical trauma. Walker's practice, from the silhouettes for which she is most known to her large-scale site-specific installations, refutes interpretive models moved by sentimentality not only for the past, but also for communal belonging and empowerment. More recently, the artist's turn toward materiality and impermanence in public monumental sculpture suggests a new, unique preoccupation with the memory of slavery and its afterlives in the now. Chapter 2 of my manuscript focuses on Wangechi Mutu's visually arresting collages of the early 21st century, when the Kenyan-born artist resided in the United States. To the artist's critics, the cyborgs are empowering, compensatory amalgams of Black womanhood and mutual belonging, self-regenerating hybrids that affirm our collective intersectional futures across time, species, and environments. Mutu's own biography is often problematically enlisted as exemplary of this exchange. In my reading, the acts of cutting, the forms of blood spattering, and the dismembering of bodies that comprise the artist's collage practice more broadly, and her cyborgs in particular, engender ways of being not predicated on wholeness or racial integration. They instead embrace alternate, at times violent and undesirable forms of transformation. Her dismembered figures, like Walker's public sculptures, destabilize assumptions concerning the continuous relationship between a shared slave past and contemporary Black political realities, as does her view of herself as a Black African woman working in the United States. Rather than symbiosis, the human, plant, animal, and mechanical parts in Mutu's collages animate an anti-communal mutualism that comes into view via dismemberment between human and non-human species. This transgressive dismemberment, as I call it, follows Walker's own interventions in disavowing reparative resistance and upending the presumption that slavery is the nexus of Black shared experience and identity. Renowned for her room-sized tableau of Black cut paper silhouettes, Walker's recent monumental public sculptures draw viewers into jarring versions of transatlantic slavery and present-day race relations that are, in the artist's words, totally demeaning and possibly very beautiful, end quote. For Mutu, women disproportionately sustain representational burdens that paradoxically relegate them to a lower social status and position them as sites of structural and metaphorical support. To counter this cultural tendency, Mutu places female figures at the center of her art as protagonists, quote, as a platform to reveal the resilience and physical/mythical power of the female body, end quote. How the artist manipulates this power, however, confounds conventional understandings of women's capacity to band together or quickly recover from traumatic experiences. Non, je ne regrette rien. No, I have no regrets. One of the most striking and unsettling collages from Mutu's 2007 Yo and I series confronts the viewer with a complex scene of dismemberment and dispossession. A maimed figure, part human, part animal, part machine, is suspended in the middle of a gray and brown haze. Severed from its upper half and projected into a cumulus abyss, only the lower limbs of the figure remain. Separated like scissors, the bottom leg extends and the top leg bends at the knee, reaching upward in a shape that mimics a scorpion's tail. Instead of a knee joint, the top leg is equipped with a motorcycle wheel that connects to spinal tubing, and instead of a foot, the bottom leg is fitted with an amalgam of animal hoof, stiletto, and blooming flower. The stiletto and blooming flower are common signifiers for female sexuality, and the figure's splotchy brown-painted skin suggests racial Blackness while also declining to confirm it. Green and gray-scaled tentacles cover its pelvic region. A coiling serpent, its skin imbued with violet, red, and other earthen hues, inhabits a portion of the left half of the picture plane. Though the serpent flanks the ruptured female body, the creature does not appear to directly interact with it in such a way as to distract from or undermine the status of the central figure. It appears in relation to the ruptured female body, a parasite-host configuration that frames and directs our view back to the aberration at the center of the image. Mesh that resembles a network of cell fragments and black-colored soil spill out of the figure's burst torso. Dark, multicolored roots sprout from the figure's lower abdomen and overlap its sprawling tentacles. The roots represent an inversion of plant and floral imagery, contrary to symbolic associations of flowers with white femininity and fertility. Colliding color fields of ochre, green, and pink spatter the gray background, apparently spewing from the figure's top leg, from which its foot appears to have been violently amputated. The birth scenes, alien mothers, and cyborgs that recur in Mutu's work animate the limits of bodily trauma and collective memory during an era of techno-optimism and post-identity desire. The recurrence of ruptured bodies and Mutu's collages in particular turn away from kinship and communal relations as loci for racial and gender belonging. Notably, the majority of her art depicts the Black female body as the ground from which non-normative conceptions of reproduction, futurity, and humanity spring. From ruptured skyborgs to the prodigal son-daughter that appears in the artist's family tree series from 2012, to the recurring alien mother motif like the one you see here, the act of creation for Mutu is an act of alienation. Simultaneously provocative and alluring and unnerving, the art of Walker and Mutu stages an apt reckoning with historical experience by contesting the white gaze, breaking open Enlightenment ideals concerning humanity, and undermining essentialist Black thinking with regard to the memory of slavery. Two of the most celebrated artists working today, Walker and Mutu create bodies of work that demonstrate their evolving engagement with their own identities as celebrity artists, as Black women, and as mothers. They are the best-known artists in my study with the largest amount of scholarship on their work, yet critics have routinely defaulted to narratives of recuperation and repair when describing each artist's practice. My analysis, by contrast, shows the ways in which the two artists foreground images of undesirable Black female being and becoming, despite their success, and how critics tie themselves in knots, describing them as redemptive and uplifting. The second half of my book in progress focuses on two artists who construct counterintuitive forms of self-display and portraiture, vis-a-vis photography and live performance. Chapter 3 frames Xavier Simmons' critical engagement with photography's semiotic properties, namely the index and its function, as a generative reordering of the ethics of historical reenactment. Rather than crafting transparent photographic images of fixed identities that reconcile the fissure between absence and presence, a tenet of contemporary histories and theories of photography more broadly, and Black portraiture specifically, Simmons found and staged portraits are often grainy and obscured, with parts of the body, namely the face, totally hidden. These acts of refusal, along with the techniques of masking and self-disavowal that the artist deploys across her practice, constitute a language of opacity that denies accountability in an era when calls for transparency and unprecedented forms of Black visibility proliferate. Like Mutu's collages, Simmons' photographs destabilize how rupture and repair, as well as surface and depth, condition individual and collective acts of seeing and knowing Black female bodies in the new millennium. Her work, which critics have described as potent, unsettling, jarring, and elliptical, has been the subject of solo shows at David Castillo Gallery in Miami and at the Kitchen in New York, as well as public art and group exhibitions that explore the meaning of freedom and justice in the new millennium. She's also the subject of a new retrospective, a mid-career retrospective at the Queens Museum that's opening soon, if not already open. So if you're in New York, please check that out. Despite this attention, she differs from both Walker and Mutu in that there is a dearth of both arts criticism and scholarship on her work. In this way, she, along with the final artist in the book, who is also the subject of my National Portrait Gallery prize-winning essay, chart additionally minor but equally path-breaking terrain. Throughout her practice, Simmons depicts various surfaces of land, of objects, of skin, without revealing much information. In Landscape 2 Women of 2007, which you see here, two brown bodies hold each other as they bend forward at the waist. With their garments flipped over their heads, large portions of the figures' bodies appear nude, but their faces are hidden. They support one another, forming the shape of an arched bridge or any number of the red rock formations found in the high desert landscapes that pervade Simmons' oeuvre. One figure stands in flip-flops, toes curled up, breasts exposed. The other, slightly more covered than their counterpart, sports red stiletto sandals that wrap around the ankle. Simmons' subjects join the other unruly sisters in my book in engendering an alternative ethics of representation that obscures subjectivities and thwarts clear-cut interpretations of sisterhood and solidarity, non-normative thematics considered to be counterintuitive to art history's ocular centrism, or politically harmful within Black study. Though Landscape Two Women depicts brown-skinned bodies in a bridge, a structure of support used to connect 2 points separated by distance and a word for reconciling conflict, the anonymity of the scene betrays the expanded terrain and mutual understanding a bridge is meant to facilitate. Viewers are only given a general sense of the location, a sidewalk, a two-tone wall of interlocking cement blocks, on which an unseen light source casts shadows. Similarly, save for the parenthetical reference to two women in the photograph's title, limited amounts of physiognomic information are present such that viewers cannot confidently confirm the gender or race of the bodies pictured. Alternately, the figures see each other, while viewers are not allowed in on that exchange. The bodies' exposed shared surfaces, therefore, are what connect them as sister subjects in the photograph, yet their identities and location remain anonymous. They are nude and highly visible, but not known. Simmons' depictions of skin as surface and her covering of key bodily features offer new, sensuous conditions of possibility for apprehending the complicated social and political life of minoritarian subjects. The obdurate Black sisters in her images lie at the interstices of hypervisibility and opacity, coalescing unbridgeable impasses that disrupt conventional narratives about the social good of art and togetherness, as well as the stakes of refusing legibility for vulnerable subjects. They also disaggregate the affective pool that the materiality of the photographic portrait and the indexicality of Black skin hold for 21st century understandings of transparency and authenticity. In so doing, she enacts the process of becoming an image, while also performing an obdurate subjectivity that refuses disclosure, thus upending, in Yuri McMillan's summation, quote, the interpretive demands of readability, certitude, and transparency so often expected of artists of color, end quote.
Hello.
Hello.
What is your name?
Narcissister.
Drawing on the myth of Narcissus and the transgressive perversity it holds for psychoanalytic theories of identity and desire, Narcissister embraces narcissism as an aesthetic and political strategy. Her mix of low and high brown performances of kinky sex, which many critics describe as reclamatory acts of self-love and care, are the topic of chapter 4 of my book. Beginning in the 1970s, narcissism became the nexus of a disparaging form of aesthetic criticism levied at feminist performance artists who use their own bodies in their live art and video art. To counter, women artists and their critics claimed performance, as well as narcissism, as self-affirming sources of creative agency and representation. Narcissister unsettles narcissism's associations with both pathological self-absorption and feminist navel-gazing by tethering narcissism to the history and memory of racialized gender subjugation. Building on Wangechi Mutu's collages of interracial, interspecies, and intermedia relations, Narcissister's art satirizes the myriad ways that American civic discourse and media promulgate images of hybrid figures as loci for a multiracial exceptionalism expected to solve the problem of the color line. In my view, her live and video works, in which she flips in and out of costumes, multiracial masks, and abject sexual scenarios, congeal into race play, a form of kinky sex that at once relishes yet exceeds erotic fetishism. A self-identified sister of African American and Moroccan Jewish descent, Narcissister burlesques her own mixed-race heritage to stage self-objectification as the limit of multiracial promise. And of all her pieces, the Dollhouse from 2011, also known as Upside Down, most poignantly alters the promise of multiracial exceptionalism. Narcissister's body and movements in the Dollhouse not only highlight how heteronormative interracial coupling continues to energize the American racial imaginary in the new millennium, they also challenge the myths of happy coexistence and post-racial futurity in a society where racial others remain inexorably disenfranchised, dominated, and oppressed. The Dollhouse has been performed at various lengths and at a variety of venues, from The Box, a neo-burlesque nightclub in New York City, to America's Got Talent, a primetime television variety show that airs on NBC. As a result, Narcissister has garnered a cult following that spans queer club culture, experimental film and performance, TV, and the high art world. Like her audiences, the Dollhouse also crosses genres, and underscoring the modes of interracial desire that imbibe Hollywood musicals and mainstream film, popular music, and material culture. At times preceded by a video set to eerie nursery music that features the artist's hands playing with a topsy-turvy doll in a multi-level wooden dollhouse. The live performance of the Dollhouse opens with Narcissister wearing a brown tone mask, a brown bob-style wig with bangs, and a red sailor dress. She is cloaked in a floor-length blue velvet hooded cape reminiscent of Little Red Riding Hood, with long white gloves covering her hands and forearms, or Cinderella. Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella, fairy tales. A large dollhouse prop is positioned upstage and center to the lyrics of At the Crossroads, a song about a girl coming of age from the 1967 Hollywood musical Dr. Dolittle. Narcissister twirls, raises her gloved hands to the sky, and slowly kneels as if praying. Narcissister's gestures mirror the lyrics of the song, quote, "Here I stand at the crossroads of life, childhood behind me, the future to come, and alone, nothing planned at the crossroads of life," end quote. She reaches far to the left, brings her hands to cover her masked eyes, and her upper body contracting and releasing in an action that resembles crying. She yearns for something, romantic love, and certainty about the future. Then the music switches to a spare disco interlude, and Narcissister turns to face upstage. She pulls her hood down to reveal another brown face mask attached to the back of her head. Her dress also has a dual identity, red sailor in the front and blue and brown paisley print in the back. She bends and disrobes before her two-headed self skips and prances across stage, eventually transitioning into another costume change that takes place while she is upside down. Foreboding music signals that something strange is afoot, and Narcissister delivers on cue as she bows her head to the floor and slowly rises into a headstand, pointing her feet. She pauses and then splits her legs dramatically to reveal a brown dress and a third head, white with a black bob and bangs, popping up between her thighs. Her legs are now arms, and her white knee-high stockings are now gloves. She spirals her torso, places her feet behind the doll head, and contracts her torso, front and side. To stand, Narcissister rolls out of a backbend, thrusts her pelvis to the audience, plays with her third self, and jumps into a series of quick hip rolls. The score changes to Upside Down, Diana Ross's 1980 pop disco hit about a woman's disorienting, self-effacing experience of romantic love, and Narcissister performs a dizzying sequence of acrobatic choreography. She flips in and out of headstands, strips topless, and turns to face the audience. Suddenly aware of her exposure, she covers her bare chest with her skirt as the music changes to a synth version of At the Crossroads. She scurries upstage and kneels as Just the Two of Us, a more promising love song than Upside Down, blasts through the speakers. Her feet walk up the dollhouse prop and she is once again in a handstand, this time with her back facing the audience. Her skirt tumbles to the floor to reveal a black and gold embroidered dress and yet another white mask erect between her legs. Flipped upside down and inside out, she is now a two-sided, four-headed, topsy-turvy doll, a toy made popular in the United States during the antebellum and postbellum periods. Thought to have originated as an act of resistance and a product of black female slave labor in the antebellum South, the topsy-turvy doll is an enduring symbol of miscegenation. It simultaneously emblematizes racial fusion, cross-racial intimacy, racial hierarchy, and sexual violence. The two halves share a waist and a skirt, and when the doll is flipped, either the white or black end is visible, a playful act of appearance and disappearance that Narcissister deploys in the dollhouse. These actions contain within them the idea of racial flip-flops, the promise or threat of total racial transformation, white to black, and vice versa, at the expense of racial concealment. As scholar Robin Bernstein explains, quote, "If one side of the topsy-turvy doll is exposed, the other side lurks, waiting beneath the skirts," end quote. Though the flip of the skirt invites play, quote, "the thing determines that the doll's black and white poles never interact," end quote, Bernstein continues, and that one character always obliterates the other, thus making racial union both contingent yet impossible, a kinky entanglement. Narcissister's live version of the topsy-turvy doll, however, ultimately refuses racial integration, keeping the masks adjacent yet separate and apart. There is no racial harmony here, and it is on and through her body that racial union or miscegenation is foiled. With the dollhouse, Narcissister crudely choreographs fantasies of miscegenation in order to thwart them, and her refutation of cross-racial intimacy is made clear in the piece's final minutes. The artist climbs on top of the dollhouse and proceeds to strip down to a sexy black singlet. Standing, she contorts her body, bending forward and backward to allow the faces on each end and side of her to alternately gaze at one another. Her hands caress her mini doll heads, and she throws back her actual head to register momentary pleasure. The unsuccessful union of the paired faces on Narcissister's front and back, however, supplant this moment. They are stuck in intimate contact, but separated by the artist's body, a fraught yet fixed estrangement that prevents them from realizing the physical embrace or self-affirming climax for which they long. The end sequence caricatures the mythos of self-love and self-discovery that organizes prevailing visions of post-racial, post-feminist futures, a facet of the artist's performance practice that typically eludes her critics. In Katie Cercone's review of The Dollhouse, Narcissister is, quote, "the integrated self. She is swiveling, wheeling, a beguiling icon of raceless, genderless, classless future feminism to come," end quote. But Narcissister's autoeroticism defies this logic. While she is temporarily excited by the myriad options available to her, the frenetic costume changes, acrobatics, vaudevillian trickery, and multiracial dummy faces do not culminate in anything resembling integration, racial utopia, or a satisfying sexual union. Neither she nor the desires of her plastic, multiracial doppelgangers personified by George Benson's lyrics, "Just the two of us, we can make it if we try," are fulfilled. With her name, multicolored masks, and performances of stereotypes such as the topsy-turvy, the every woman, and the mammy, the artist plays with the polysemy of gender and racial affinity to redefine how we imagine community and solidarity in the new millennium. Instead of romantically revering multiracial mutability, her work challenges the reparative viability of interracial intimacy within identity-based art and performance, contemporary theories of feminism, and coalitional politics. In so doing, her work compels us to interrogate the pitfalls of inclusive theorizing that have emerged in the wake of intersectionality's mainstream popularity, from shared identity categories, such as race and gender, to shared national memory. Her topsy-turvy, kinky art, in short, underscores how individual and collective attachments to the language of commonality and coherence mask and occlude the messiness of subjectivity and difference. Centering Black women's visual alterity and minor aesthetic strategies brings a much-needed perspective to critical theories of contemporary identity-based art. The sisters we encounter in my project are marked by rupture, opacity, and frenzy, not repair, pleasure, or desirable metamorphosis. These refusals rebuff representational norms that conscript Black women's creative labors into caregiving endeavors believed to beget self-determination and social transformation. In so doing, they reveal the omnipresence of historical injury, as well as unexpected strategies of survival that expand the aesthetic and ethical terrain of what it means to be Black and woman now. This paradigm shift matters now because it engenders a critique of unwavering faith in quote-unquote good behavior, as well as wholeness and togetherness as the means for racial reconciliation and progress. Considering the current US political climate, ongoing racial and gender violence, and debates about the relationship between art and social protest, this work is particularly timely and urgent. Thank you. And now we have questions. There are microphones on either side of the audience. There's also a reception afterwards, and you can ask me questions there too. I cannot hear you now. I'm sure that if you wanted to, I can hear you. If you have a question, you can just raise your hand. Hello. Oh, but your projection is. Come through, yes.
Thank you for a talk that I will be thinking about for maybe months as I work on my own project. It's just very
Yay.
generative and exciting.
Thank you.
And I'm going to ask you a question that you could just say, no, I don't want to go there. But I'm wondering about how the second part of your talk comments on the first half.
Okay.
If you follow what I'm saying. You start off with Beyonce and
Okay.
one way that she's doing art in Black women.
Yep.
But it seems to me that your talk is in a critique of that.
That's right. You got it. You answered your own question. I start with Beyonce, but I can tell you why I start with Beyonce, which I think is part of what you're asking me. I start with Beyonce because in a room like this, where there are a lot of people who don't know me or art history or anything, I, for instance, was on not anything, it was anything elliptical, excuse me, sorry. I started to change thoughts and that sounded terrible. But I was on the plane here and I was in a row with a former professor of journalism at a state university in Los Angeles Valley. And she and her husband were like, oh my God, you're giving a talk at the National Portrait Gallery. Oh my God, we love DC, amazing. Like, what's your talk on? And I was like, oh, Black women's art and activism in the 21st century. And they were like, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know any Black women artists. But you know Beyonce, don't you? Everybody knows Beyonce. So that's why I start with Beyonce. But also, like I explained, she has become such a kind of pervasive presence in how we globally understand Black womanhood. That's exactly what the full project is doing, is kind of critiquing how there's the mainstreaming of intersectionality. You can be an influencer, you can be woke, and it's all this kind of cultural capital to be woke, to be able to kind of like understand Beyonce and her as a transparent object, site of cultural production, as a person, even though we don't really know anything about her interiority. By design, I actually think I'm like, she's performing disclosure in ways that's interesting, but I don't want to write on that. So that's why I start with Beyonce, and Beyonce also becomes this kind of text, and has become a kind of text for Black feminist practice as well, Black feminist praxis. And I have so many friends in the Academy who I love and hang out with and can totally like socialize with, who really attach a kind of radicality to Beyonce that I find highly problematic. So that's what the book is doing. I'm trying to be nice about it, though. I don't want to get dragged by the hive, you know. I want to live. So yeah. But thank you for your question. Did I answer your question? Partially. Okay, cool.
The microphone is now working, so please don't be shy. And as you think about your questions, I would like to ask Dr. Barber about, we loved your essay for so many reasons, but really as a portrait gallery historian, we really appreciated how you stretch the definition of portraiture. And I think our audience would really love to hear a bit more about how you see portraiture interacting with your work, and the role that you that the art that you're studying in your book and beyond, like the cues that it takes from portraiture and how it might maybe question the traditional definitions or query, sort of what people think of as a portrait, and what your thoughts are about that.
Yes. So similar to Professor Van Diver, I also teach a class on Black portraiture. It's called The Black Portrait. In fact, Lastarsha McGarity, my former student who's currently at the University of Delaware, was in that class. And we start with that question. One, what is a portrait? Similar. And also, what is Black about the Black portrait, right? And so we're trying to locate what portraiture as a practice, as a genre is. And so part of what the project is doing, especially in the second half of the book, by focusing on Zyvera and Narcissister, is looking at how Zyvera specifically says in interviews like, oh, portraiture and landscape are interchangeable for me. So already we have a kind of post-conceptual breakdown of these boundaries, these kind of medium-specific boundaries, right, between what a portrait is and does in public space, when it's exhibited, when it's being made in an artist studio, when it starts to circulate, all of these things. And then the chapter on Narcissister is particularly interesting because I only focus on her live performance work, but she does a lot of self-portrait work. And part of the self-portrait work I read as, it's a lot of collage-based stuff, again, kind of cutting up masks and making these flatter forms that then she, I think, uses as a kind of sketching pad to the larger, more transgressive and exciting, titillating performance work. But it's also very much, her name in itself is like about the self, right? She's like disavowing, like, oh, I'm not this thing. I'm a whole public persona, because she doesn't reveal her real identity when she's in character and costume. And it's not even an alter ego. It's really like a whole separate entity. And so she's building on kinds of practices of self-display and portraiture that folks like Cindy Sherman, who we probably would be more familiar with potentially, particularly in feminist art history, and doing something completely different, right, with her body. But I want to go back to your question real quick. That I hope that this will also start to answer the last, or the unfulfilled part, is that part of the intervention that I'm making is bringing a kind of sense of, bad words, pessimism and negativity into Black feminist theorizing that is already it's latent, it's definitely there, but a lot of Black feminist folks, and especially art historians who write on Black women, and non-binary and femmes, and we're turning, because of the queer turn from the 1980s to present. That's also coincident with Black feminist theorizing being adopted in the academy, right? So that's also what the project is doing. I hope that answers more of your question. Okay, cool.
I want to thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I want to say that of all the 4 people you presented, I'm only familiar with Kara Walker, whose work I love and whose work
At
inspired
least
me
you
a
got
lot.
one of them.
And I'm glad to have 3 more names to research and to learn about, so thank you.
Yeah.
I have 2 fault questions. The first question is, as an art historian, can you please let us know how you guys define the relationship between feminism and post-feminism?
Okay.
When does one stop and the other one start? I'm very
Gotcha.
interested in that nuance of when does the continuation or the post happen. The second question is a follow-up on what she was asking about what is portrait. I'm absolutely fascinated with the self-portrait as a subject. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the crossing between portrait and identity and gender, and how wide the issue of portrait can be as opposed to national identity, as opposed to racial identity. So with the little that I know about Kara Walker's work, it is in a way the whole earth becomes a portrait, a self-portrait of issues that she cares about, of issues that she is passionate about. And her work becomes not only a portrait, but a voice for who she is as an artist and as a Black woman. Can you please comment on that?
Absolutely. What was I? Something came to mind when you were, the feminism to post-feminism controversy. So I don't use the term post-feminism in my work because for Black women, that doesn't exist. Which isn't a knock toward you, just like the way that feminism has been attached to a kind of white liberal female identity and political formation, apolitical formation. The post-feminism is also that. Like it's like, it's about a certain kind of privilege to disavow a political position that Black women don't have because, one, maybe they don't want to, but most importantly, because of phenotypically, because of the way that they read, it's not possible. And also, I think part of what the project, it's not doing, but it's indebted to, is that kind of line of Black feminist theorizing from the late 1980s to present that also is the intersectional turn, with Kimberly Crenshaw. And so post-feminism, especially because of of violences that Black women endure on a daily basis, isn't a category that I think Black women inhabit easily, nor maybe is a desirable category for them. So that's one. And then the portraiture piece about Kara Walker specifically, there's been so much written on her silhouette work, and that silhouette's obviously being a kind of extension of portraiture, or an extension of kind of high portraiture, let's say, that I don't write about that in the book per se, although I do a kind of like overview of it. I'm more interested in her public sculptures, and with the Mammy sculpture, a subtlety, and the way that she kind of adopts this kind of negress alter ego. I think you're right that there is self-portraiture in her work, even when, quote unquote, figuratively it's not there, right? In her titles and in the way she writes about or talks about her own practice. And interestingly enough, what I talk about in the project in the first chapter is how she comes to a kind of consciousness, or at least publicly performs a kind of radical consciousness about not wanting to be counted and not wanting to be hyper visible in this way that she's become since the 90s, since her first show. And the kinds of expectations of representation that she has been made to, that she has herself designed, but that has become really, really popular and marketable. Like she gets, all these commissions to do the same thing over, and she's like, I'm not a one-trick pony, I can do other things. I also don't want to be a role model, so stop doing that to me too. So that's also what the project is trying to think about, how she's coming to, in these later years, or maybe midlife, let's call it midlife. Let's be generous. Her midlife years, where she starts to kind of, and for the last, I'd say 5 years for sure, if not longer, 5 to 8, she's been much more, I think, vocal and self-conscious about how she has become a consumable object in the art market. So that's also what the project is kind of like thinking about, especially in that first half with these kind of more celebrity artists, like how they're self-consciously engaging with their hypervisibility, yet still being kind of minor figures within the canon.
Thank you.
Do you have a question? Great.
Hi, thanks so much for
Yes,
this.
thank you.
This has been so amazing. I really appreciate that you are an individual that felt free to, move from dancing to being an art historian. I think that, you're just very inspirational, basically.
Thank you.
I really liked how you incorporated the different photos of art as well as videos and actual fine photography art as well. So I wanted to ask, because I consider myself who's someone that's active in my community. I'm also a fashion designer, so I feel like I'm kind of just crossing different boundaries and stuff. And oftentimes I'm kind of wondering, people who are in similar positions, who are you inspired by? Especially because you won this prize, and it's I can kind of hear your passion when you speak about it. Not kind, I definitely hear your passion when you speak about it.
I'm like, I hope so.
Yes, no,
I have committed my life to this
No,
work.
that's what I'm saying. I can clearly see it. So yeah, I just wanted to know who inspired you, but also if there's in different aspects, people have inspired you, as a writer or a speaker and as a dancer too.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, my inspirations and influences are very, very immediate. So immediate that they're in this room right now. I didn't, I opened the talk in a different way, but for the last couple of years, I've been giving a version of some talk, not a version, a version of an introduction that includes pictures of my mother painting and the ideas that she had as, my mother was graduated high school in '72, so she was like a Black Power baby. And so when I was growing up, it was so much of these images of the Afro and Black is beautiful, and my grandmother too. We had images of Black women cut out from magazines. This is a typical story, but it was so profoundly shaping for me. And then I didn't go into visual art practice. I didn't even do, it was arts and crafts when I was a kid. And then I went into dancing because my mom was like, you're in the front of the TV all the time, listening to Michael Jackson and doing your thing. Let's put you in dance lessons. And I was like, okay. And so my formation as an art historian started there, but also in terms of how, as a dancer, you have to look at a thing. It's really mimetic in a lot of ways, and which is mimesis is a foundation for art history, at least Western art history. And so it's kind of imitating, looking at a thing, imitating it, and then for dance, putting it on your body and trying to emulate the exact thing that this person was doing, even though y'all's bodies are very different. Y'all aren't the same person and never will be. And so even those kinds of hiccups, translations, differences, or whatever are still also very present for me. And then I'd say a lot of people in this room, mostly situated on this side of the room, funny enough, from those rows onward, from the fourth row onward. And other giants in the field who've come before and have laid out a kind of terrain for which I can into which I can intervene, and I'm very grateful. And then I'll say, and I should have said this before, and I typically do, that without my dissertation advisor, the late great Douglas Crimp, I would not be doing the work that I'm doing. He is a cornerstone of queer studies. I think maybe begrudgingly so, but whatever. He's not here to debate me. So, but he really challenged me to be an art historian who went against an entire sub-discipline and to really be okay with that. And obviously I've refined it over time. I'm not this take down an art history kind of person, but really thinking about what's possible in these pockets and why people aren't embracing certain discourses, even though we might be talking about them in private, and even enacting them in our own lives without having a language or vocabulary for it. And so that's really what I guess is kind of my fluent influence framework.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question.
So it's my unfortunate pleasure to, I'm so sorry. We have
was a
a
great question to end on, though. I love
reception, and maybe if you still have questions for Dr. Barber, we could ask them then. I do have a little gift for Dr. Barber that Dr. Van Diver is going to deliver just on behalf of the National Portrait Gallery. We are so grateful for your scholarship, and we just wanted to make sure that you had a nice memento of your experience here tonight. And yeah, so if all of you would join me with applause for Dr. Barber and thanking her. And
I also just want to say thank you to Kara,
yes,
the ASL interpreter. I've never had an ASL interpreter at one of my talks. This is very thrilling. And also kudos to the National Portrait Gallery for thinking about accessibility. Appreciate you.
thank you. So we invite you to gather in the lobby just outside these doors, and please feel free to have a drink, enjoy the snacks, and thank you again, Dr. Barber.